All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Rupal Patel. I am the Vice President of Voice and Accessibility at Veritone. I'm also a professor at Northeastern University. And I am going to be talking today about a new kind of voice prosthesis, using AI. I don't have some of the slides that have some audio on them, so we're just going to have to use our imagination, or I'll catch you later and we'll play the slides for you later. But in the meantime, I am going to actually just start with just a kind of an overall introduction to why we even want to create a voice prosthesis for someone that is individualized. So if you think about every single one of us in this room, we each have a unique voice, a voice that says who we are. It's how people remember us. It's really the languages we speak, the accents we have, the places where we come from, uniquely identify us. And so today there's been a lot of conversation about voice as identity, and voice is really the one key feature that we think that we hold really close to who we are, right? So this is a core belief of the company that I had founded called VocaliD, which was recently acquired by Veritone, that our voices are, they're not identical, and they are in fact our identities. So the next little video clip that I want to play you is of a gentleman who has throat cancer and had lost his voice to this. So we heard a lot today about people like voice actors or use cases for voice AI in the entertainment and media industry. But what I want to talk about today in this particular talk is what if it's people like you and I? People like you and I who may, or people that we love, who may have some kind of a condition where they lose their ability to speak, maybe temporarily, or it may be for forever. And what do you do? So here's Lonnie's story. So Lonnie says that he's a truck driver and he uses colorful speech, and that he had a couple of weeks to record his voice because they found out that he had throat cancer, and had to not only remove his voice box, but also part of his tongue. And so he talks about how much change there's going to be, and the fact that he's happy that someone told him that he could bank his voice ahead of time. So that's what he says in this first movie. So what are his options? So basically, within these 2 weeks, he went from a talking, walking person, right, who really didn't even think that this was a possibility, to understanding and realizing that not only am I not going to be able to speak, but I'm also not going to be able to swallow like I used to, because my tongue is a very important piece of my body that's required to move food from the front of my mouth to the back of my mouth. So I'm going to have thickened liquids or semi-solid foods to eat. These are all the things that he's learning within a 2-week period of time. And just imagine what's happening in his world. He's just sort of being rocked completely. It's not just his identity of his voice, but it's just a being, just a full human, right? Like we think about eating as such a central part of how we have joy in our lives, right? And so a lot of this changed for him. One of the other things he says in that video is that because he was recording, or when he was recording his voice, he was able to really kind of get more comfortable with this whole loss that was going to happen to him, because he was kind of distracted, as well as thinking about how fortunate he was that he caught that in time and was able to kind of record his voice ahead of time. So that's what he says in that first video. So what are his options? He has two options. That was the standard of care before too long ago. One option is called an electrolarynx, where you hold up this razor-like thing to your voice box, and it makes the electrical impulse that your vocal folds typically make to produce speech. His tongue, in his case, part of his tongue wasn't removed, not all of it, but his mouth and his lips can still move, and so he can still sort of make different consonants and vowels. And so that electrolarynx was enough to create the impulse for speech production, and then he could use that. So we have a beatboxer here who can tell us all about that. So that's what, but it's a low-cost device, but it's also a little bit, it's hard when you've had radiation in this area to hold the electrolarynx. You can't fully get a good voice. It also sounds very, very robotic when you speak with an electrolarynx. The other option is something called a TEP, a tracheoesophageal puncture. That's actually a surgical option where they put a valve, a one-way valve, right in this area, and so that creates the air pressure to come out for speech production. It does produce better speech. The problem is it's a surgical invasive surgery that every few months has to actually be changed again because the secretions from your vocal tract will come in and then it'll actually infect that area. And so it's just constant care for the wound, right? So he's gone from, not only not being able to temporarily maybe eat and speak, but also these kind of lifelong changes in his life. So it's not unheard of that the doctor will not explain all of these other things in terms of speaking and voice loss and swallowing changes. They'll just talk about saving your life, right? And so I think that's important from the doctor's perspective. That's important, but I think here, when we're talking about voice, we understand that we can replicate the voice and improve the quality of life for these individuals. So I think until not too long ago, the technology for making a customized voice per individual was really just not possible, right? It would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, to create a customized voice. And that's one thing that we were trying to change. And in the case of someone like Lonnie, he could actually record his own voice. And so we could actually build a voice based on his own recordings, which is a little bit more inexpensive to do than if we had to figure out some other way to create a voice for him that suited him. And he didn't want to just use a voice like the generic voices out there because that's not him, that's not his identity. And so how do you do that? So conventional speech synthesis technology requires you to record hours of speech. It used to be tens of hours of speech. Today, we can get away with fewer hours of speech. And of course, people will tell you that you can make a synthesized voice with 5 minutes of speech. It's true. But a 5-minute sample of speech production to create a synthetic voice that's robust sounding, that's going to sound like a 5-minute sample of speech. It's going to sound pretty crappy. So what we've learned over time is that it's about 90 minutes of good, clean audio to create a robust sounding voice that can be understood in all sorts of environments. So for someone like Lonnie, he had to bank his own voice. This is not really that novel a thing because, in terms of we've been making synthetic voices for voice actors and applications for a long time, but it's hard to actually create something for an end user who's a consumer who doesn't necessarily know a lot about things like balancing, noise levels, signal-to-noise ratios, using an everyday mic, turning on the right microphone when you're recording, and so on and so forth. So we made it super easy to record the voice. And again, you're probably not going to be able to watch this video because it's not working, but I'll play it for you so you can see the video part, and I'll narrate it. What he's doing here is that within those 2 weeks that he had between understanding that he had to have the surgery and going in for the surgery, is he started recording on the VocaliD platform, where he recorded, it says 4,000 sentences, but he recorded actually 2,000 something sentences for us to then recreate his voice. He didn't get through all of his recordings. But it was enough for us to then create a synthetic voice for him. So this next slide, which you also won't hear the audio for, but let's say you have 2,000 recordings of Lonnie, recorded across, basically we give him the script line by line to read aloud, and then that script or those recordings are used to train a neural network model of speech synthesis. So the neural net essentially takes the text that we've given him to read aloud and the spoken audio, and it tries to find consistencies between text and speech and builds a model to understand how to replicate that speech for novel new sentences. So now Lonnie can not only say the things he said, in fact, he probably will never say those things because those were just random phrases and stories that we'd given him to read aloud, but that becomes the content for us to create this computational model. Now he'll type in whatever he wants, the I love yous to the I want waters or whatever else, and he'll be able to say it in a voice that sounds like him. And so we used to call that the vocal legacy, given that they now have the capabilities of using their own voice for all their communication. So what if you're not like Lonnie? What if you weren't able to record your voice ahead of time? Because maybe you were born with a speech condition, or maybe you learned too late in your disorder that you had to have this procedure. And so you don't have enough time, or you only record maybe 500 sentences and not enough for us to make a good enough voice. So that's where we start using different methods of speech science to kind of combine them with the changes in machine learning that have happened as well. So there's a theory of speech production called the source filter theory of speech production. And it's it's a theory. It's not perfect. But the theory goes like this, that you have the source of speech production, which is the vibrations of the vocal folds, and you have in the same individual that excitation that is pushed through the rest of the vocal tract, the chambers of your head and your neck, to produce the consonants and vowels. And when we're producing speech synthetically, we can decouple these. So we can just take the source from one person and just the filter from the other. Speech identity cues are both in the source as well as the filter. But in this case, many people with very severe speech disorder, you don't want the way they produce consonants and vowels because they produce them in a way that's not clear enough to be understood, which is why they have to use a device to talk. And so we mostly get the information from their source. So we ask them to produce some sounds, and then we get whatever speaker identity cues we can from them, and then we essentially take the source characteristics from one person by inverse filtering them. It's like a whole process to create this. And then inverse filtering the voice of the donor voice. So the donors are people similar to them in age, who speak the same accent, so people from around the world who have recorded, and then we can recombine them. Take just the source from the person we want it to sound like, and just the filter from their age-matched speech donor, and recombine them digitally. And that's what we were doing for people unlike like Lonnie, so people who are born with different conditions. We can also, of course, for people who haven't recorded enough, we can do a blend of the two, the source filter combination, as well as some of the recordings that they have to augment the data set. So I first had the chance to talk about this work at the TED Women's stage in 2013, a long time ago, and that's what's really sparked the beginning of wanting to create, or being able to create, these unique synthetic voices for everyday people who were suffering from voice loss. And what we didn't know, so one of the things that I suggested at the end of my talk is, what if you could donate your voice? What if you could donate your voice to someone in need? And it was really one of these sort of last-minute things that I thought, let's add that in, and thought maybe a couple hundred people would sign up to do this, because at that time it was about a 10-hour recording period. So you'd have to record 10 hours of speech in my lab at the university, and it was just, I figured even if a few people volunteer, it'll be 10x the number of people that have volunteered so far. Instead, we got thousands of people who wanted to donate their voice. And that's really what sparked the creation of the voice bank. So it's really come a long way. Today, the Veterans Association actually is able to cover some of the costs of us creating voices for people who are non-speaking, and it's become the next standard of care. So we have the electrolarynx, we had the TEP, and now, hopefully, we can get now AI voice. We just have to get clinicians to start adopting that. So I wanted to leave you with a few stories, stories of some of the people like Lonnie who we've served over the last few years. You'll just see the kind of things that people talk about is not just, the voice is not just for that individual who's lost their voice. That voice is actually so much more important for that individual's family members and those who love them, because that's how they know that individual. That's how they think of that person. And so this first quote here, it's a daughter of a gentleman who lost his voice, and she talks about the fact that when he used his new synthetic voice, she actually looked forward to talking to him because before that, listening to the other sort of generic voice that the device came with was just so much more painful and heartbreaking. There's a number of other stories like this. I have so many different quotes. One is, this morning Ryan talked about Bill Nudie, the gentleman who had ALS and has progressively gotten worse with his voice. Didn't really think about banking his voice, because in ALS often there's so many other things that are going on that people think, I'll just do it later, or maybe I'll have one of my brother or someone else that I know donate their voice, and then when they get at the end where their voice is really not strong enough, that's when they regret it. So today, each one of us is sort of walking around with a phone and a recording device in our back pocket, right? So we can save our voices, we can preserve our voices for today and for the future. And I think each of us in this room and others, we've actually been working with larger organizations where they have their volunteers, their employees actually volunteer for our voice sharing initiative, where they record their voice on the Human Voice Bank platform, and then we can share that and use that to sort of upcycle, I call it, the voices of you and I, so that we can help those who are suffering from different kinds of voice loss. So today there's like 95 5,000 people who have contributed to the Voice Bank initiative, about 18 million sentences in the Human Voice Bank from 120 countries, from people ranging in age from 6 all the way to 91. So we've also seen that for school-age kids, it's been really interesting to get them engaged in voice banking because they're reading aloud. So that's one thing, it's just sort of like another skill. But they're also learning about disability because they can share their voice with someone who doesn't have a voice. So there's actually some really interesting things that have come from the Voice Bank initiative. I want to end, actually, it's not on this slide, but I want to end on a story. So a few years ago, we were working, one of the VP of Voice of Engineering, at VocaliD was a gentleman who was just really keen on our technology, and he recorded his own speech. And so we often used his voice. We just always wondered, why does James' voice turn out so good, his synthetic voice? And we often used it for different demos and this and that. And he was just a real advocate for our technology. About 3 weeks ago, I got a message from him, a text message from him saying, Rupal, I've been thinking a lot about what we were doing at VocaliD, and thank goodness we recorded my voice. And I was just like, why? And he says, well, because I just had a surgery. So I found out I had tongue cancer. And initially just thought it was a canker sore. Ignored it for a while. And then eventually, when the pain got really hard, bad, I went in again, got a biopsy, learned that I had tongue cancer. Doctor said, well, put this ointment on. If it doesn't get away, come back again. It was bad. So then he had to have 30% of his tongue removed, not his voice box, thankfully, but 23 lymph nodes in addition. He's 41 years old, has no other risk factors whatsoever to oral cancer. Super fit guy. And none of the other exposure aspects either. So it was one of these things where it was a big reminder where, again, the doctors told him about some of the things, well, you're going to have the surgery done in 2 weeks, you've got this much time. He was not told about the swallowing issues, was not told about, the voice and speech issues whatsoever. And yet there was this. At least he knew to ask some questions about it. But I just hope that, so I did have a QR code on the new slides where you could learn more about his story. I've been hearing more stories like this, and I hope that what we can do is, through this conference and other venues like this, raise awareness about oral cancer and about just conditions where, for lots of reasons, one of us may lose our voice, temporarily even. And what happens when you can't speak is you cannot communicate and interact with the world, and that is very, very isolating. And so when we think about healthcare costs from all of these other disorders, we have to think about the mental costs as well of incurring this kind of impairment, right? Even if it's just temporary. So I hope that people will just we can raise the awareness and think also about new initiatives and new ways that technology today that we're building can affect not only the bigger sort of players, the enterprise applications that we have, but how do they have effects on the accessibility and inclusive capabilities of this technology as well. We started from the grassroots, going from accessibility to the bigger companies or the bigger opportunities because it was very early. But I also think now that big companies like Veritone have been really committed to taking that initiative and amping it up further in terms of how we can not only work with people with different disabilities, but also accessibility, as Ryan mentioned this morning, across languages and cultures as well. So thank you for listening, and I don't know if I have any time. If we have 1 minute, so one question, I guess. And I can play you all the samples at another time. Yes. Jen?
Oh, Mike, I have to go inside of that.
Oh.
Hi, Rupal.
Hi.
You mentioned there about a really diverse age range.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated if you've been doing any work on actually trying to age voices.
Yeah.
So especially maybe for kids that might be tricky, but if someone's in their 20s, you're going to have a very different voice in your 60s. So I would love to know more about that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, so we actually think about voices in 4 age bands. So the kid voice, the teenage voice, the adult voice, and the mature voice. And so within those age bands, you can algorithmically modify the voice. But when you go across those age bands, let's say you go from a child voice to an adolescent voice, there's a jump. And actually, we hear it as voice breaks, right? Like in boys as they're changing from boys to adolescent males. Same way, if we just use the same model and try to modify it algorithmically, algorithmically, it will sound pretty bad. And so there we actually rebuild the voice model when we go across age bands. So within age bands, we algorithmically change it, but we actually have a patent on aging a voice. And you can not only just age a voice going up, but you can also age a voice going down so you can get a voice lift, and so sound younger. And that might be important or interesting to those who want to, keep their youthful voice alive. So, all right, thank you.